Hey, welcome to episode 6 of 25 levels of cutting boards. Nearing the end, these boards are getting more and more complicated. The first board of this series is made with strips of ash and sapelli and is a concept that I've wanted to do ever since I saw a picture of it online. It's a board with a 3D effect that looks like building blocks, but you'll see the end result quite soon. Now to make it, we need to cut some strips of 2 different thicknesses and sides angled at 30 degrees. What that allows us to do is to make 2 very similar boards with alternating ash and sapelli. Now once those 2 boards are glued together, we can plane down the 2 boards using the drum sander and then move on to cutting some strips from each board. Now as you can see, I'm alternating strips from each board and aligning them 2 at a time only, and misaligning them every 2 strips intentionally to get that 3D effect. Now once the glue up is cured, I pass the board through the planer once more and trim the edges, and then add a chamfer to the top and bottom and sand the board down. I add a CNC juice groove and holes for the feet. I then oil the result, which reveals those building blocks I was talking about. Now if you look closely, the top layers aren't perfectly aligned because during the glue up I didn't clamp the thin layer as hard, and it resulted in a slight variation of the glue joint thickness, and therefore a misalignment. That's what makes this board so difficult to make. Everything needs to be just right. Now the end result is still great, and the mistake can only be seen if you're looking for it, so in the end I really like that board and love the 3D effect. I might just have to keep it for myself due to the small mistake on my part, but that is definitely not a problem for me. Now the second board is a Basketweave board with a mix of end grain and edge grain. I wanted to make this one and place it in the top 9 because it requires a completely different type of glue up compared to regular boards. I chose to make the strips out of an ash base and sapelli outlines and make the squares between the strips with Paduke. As always, I plane the strips down that I cut to make sure that their dimension is as accurate as possible, and that way I've got some sanding lines on the faces to increase the glue bond by increasing the contact surface area. Then I start cutting some blocks of the Paduke strips and move on to cutting the thin strips of sapelli that I then glue to the ash to make these boards that I will use to make the weave, and then cut up those boards to the right dimensions. Generally, I was accurate to about 0.4 millimeters on the lengths of the block, so I was worried about alignment issues and gaps in the board, but it turned out incredible compared to what I expected. So I'd say 0.5 millimeter is an acceptable margin of error. Now the glue up is where this board takes its place in the difficulty rating. You actually have to glue every single part separately. To make sure that process was fast enough for the glue not to cure before I was done, I had to pour a puddle of glue on the side and use it to dip the parts and glue them faster that way, while also making sure I have excess glue all over to fill those gaps I was talking about earlier. Now after planing the board down, I had the pleasant surprise of not seeing a single flaw or gap in it, so it was incredible. Finally, the last step is to finish the board, which requires trimming the edges, adding a chamfer, sanding, CNC juice grooving, and of course, oiling to reveal the grain. Now note that this type of board necessarily has end grain to edge grain glue ups, but it's inevitable. That being said, the end grain Paduke squares are also technically acceptable since it's actually an edge grain to edge grain glue connection. Now after adding the feet, the end result looks fantastic, and I couldn't be prouder of that board. There is not a single gap or defect in the wood. The final board is the most difficult because it only involves angled cuts as well in varying directions. It's a honeycomb pattern board, and I've always loved this type of design since it brings you back to the food while displaying a beautiful symmetry. So we start off with some ash strips that are cut at 30-degree angles on both sides, and add some sapelli strips that are also angled at 30 degrees on the side. I don't have any clamps adapted for this type of glue up, so I simply used tape. Now during the glue up, I did have a few minor issues with the ends, which I was able to fix by recutting the planks to get 30-degree angle again, and adding some thin strips of sapelli to fill the gaps in the glue. Then I planed down the faces on the sander and cut strips that are twice as thin as the side strips and glue them on using a big board as a clamp that I weighed down with boxes of steel pen cases that I ship my pens in. I'll explain why the half thickness later on. Now, sorry for the blurriness, but now you can see the difference in thickness of the 2 sapelli strips whose edges I trimmed using a hand planer. Now I sand down those strips on the drum sander and glue them all together to get my final patterned board, and then I pass it through the planer to get it nice and flat for the end grain glue up. Now that it's ready, I can cut many strips of that board on the table saw, and as I'm doing the final glue up, you can understand why I used half thickness sapelli on the tops and bottoms of the boards. Since we're alternating strips, this half thickness is seen twice in a row and therefore results in a full thickness, which leads to nice hexagons with a constant outer thickness of sapelli. Now once the glue up is complete, the final step is to do the trimming, chamfers on the top and bottom, sanding as well, and adding holes for the feet before doing the CNC juice groove and finishing the board with linseed oil and beeswax. This is important to seal the board nicely and protect it from variations of moisture by sealing it. Now, the final result looks amazing, and it's one of my favorite boards so far. The ash pattern is a big plus as well. Please let me know in the comments which is your favorite board between the three and which has been your favorite board overall so far. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my video and hope to see as many of you in the comments of this and future videos so we can interact. I will see you guys quite soon with episode 7. Take care.